A police officer with a racist mindset brazenly pulls over a black woman, claiming she exhibited suspicious behavior in the area. There is no evidence, no reasonable explanation, just an abuse of power disguised as a standard procedure. But this time, he has no idea that the woman behind the wheel is none other than the newly appointed chief of police in the district. When the truth is revealed, the officer's left stunned, and a dramatic story unfolds. What happens when a leader not only confronts misconduct within the system, but also must prove that change is imperative? For the female police chief, this is not just a personal confrontation. It is a long and arduous journey to challenge deeply ingrained biases and confront the injustices entrenched in the system. This story doesn't just expose a shocking reality, it raises an essential question. How should power truly be wielded? Join us as we dive into this gripping tale. But before we begin, let us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button to ensure you don't miss other meaningful stories like this one. Angela Carter adjusted the rearview mirror in her car as the last rays of sunlight bathed the streets of Grandview in a golden glow. The car glided smoothly past the neighborhoods she once called home, carrying the weight of her thoughts after a long day. Having just concluded an important meeting at the police department, Angela felt the gravity of her new position, the police chief of a district infamous for decades-long racial tensions. For Angela, this wasn't just a job, it was a mission. As the first black woman to hold the position, she was acutely aware of the scrutinizing gazes and whispered remarks behind her back. Even during this morning's meeting, the palpable reluctance from some officers, especially Captain Mark Johnson, made the room feel stifling. Johnson, a middle-aged man with a long tenure in the force, was displeased about taking orders from someone like her. "With all due respect, Chief, I don't think this plan is practical," Mark stated bluntly, his tone silence in the room. Angela didn't react immediately. She met his gaze, her sharp eyes revealing the resilience of someone who had faced far greater challenges. "Whether it's practical or not, Captain Johnson is something we'll prove together, and I believe in the ability of this team," she replied, her voice calm yet authoritative. The tension from that encounter lingered as she left the station. Deep down, Angela knew that people like Mark weren't a personal threat, but a symbol of a system in desperate need of reform. Challenges like these were nothing new to her. Angela recalled her upbringing in a working-class family in East Grandview. Her father, James Carter, was a passionate civil rights activist who fought tirelessly for equality. He had instilled in Angela an unshakable determination and a desire to change the world. A lifetime of memories flashed through her mind. From her earliest days on the police force, Angela endured unspoken discrimination. Male colleagues often dismissed her, while others doubted her capabilities as a black woman. But she refused to let such biases hold her back. Angela climbed the ranks, first as a rookie, then as a detective, and now as police chief. The Grandview she watched in the sunset still carried the beauty of her childhood memories, but Angela was keenly aware of the deep cracks beneath the surface. The neighborhood she once called home remained mired in poverty, with an overwhelming police presence more inclined to monitor than protect. These realities drove Angela to accept the role of police chief, despite warnings that she would face resistance both within and outside the department. Angela sighed, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. "I'm not here to be liked," she told herself. "I'm here to make a difference." The car continued its smooth journey through brightly lit streets, preparing her for a long night of reflection and planning for the days ahead. Angela knew that to transform Grandview, she would need more than determination. She would need patience, wisdom, and, at times, a willingness to confront the unexpected. The car glided silently down streets deeply entwined with Angela's childhood, drawing memories like a film playing in slow motion. She thought of East Grandview, rows of aging houses, children's laughter echoing alongside the piercing wails of police sirens. This place was the bedrock of her resolve, but also the place where she first truly understood injustice. Angela grew up in a working-class family where resilience was a necessity. Her father, James Carter, was not only a model parent but also a renowned local civil rights leader. She vividly remembered evenings when he returned home from protests, his shirt stained with mud and his eyes alight with unwavering belief. He often told her, "Justice doesn't come from fear. You have to face it, fight for it, and make it your own." His teachings became deeply embedded in Angela's soul, but living up to them was far from easy. From the moment she joined the police force, Angela realized that her race and gender made her a target for skepticism and prejudice. Colleagues like Paul Stevens, a younger officer with ambitious aims, often sidelined her. Paul wasn't overtly vocal, but his condescending glances, snide comments, and covert alliances with other officers made Angela acutely aware of her isolation. Her first true triumph came during a major case involving a drug gang operating in the area. While seasoned officers hit dead ends, Angela quietly gathered evidence over several weeks, even embedding herself in the community to build trust with residents who were wary of law enforcement. One night, following a lead from a source she had painstakingly cultivated, Angela led a raid that resulted in the capture of the gang's key members. It was a milestone victory, but it came at a cost. Officers like Paul Stevens, who had failed to crack the case earlier, couldn't hide their resentment. "She just got lucky," Paul once remarked to a colleague, his tone tinged with derision. But Angela knew her success wasn't luck. It was the product of dedication and an unyielding belief in justice. In her hardest moments, Angela turned to Karen Mitchell, her closest friend and mentor. Karen, a psychologist and community activist, had fought similar battles advocating for Black women in Grandview. "Angela, don't let people like Paul define your path," Karen often said, her eyes brimming with determination. "You're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for those who need to see that change is possible." Karen's encouragement sustained Angela during her toughest times. In countless conversations at a corner cafe, Karen reminded her that this fight wasn't just personal. It was for a generation waiting for her to forge a path. Angela's journey wasn't solely about personal victories but lessons in perseverance and courage. She learned to turn obstacles into motivation and confront adversaries like Paul Stevens, not with anger but with resolve and intelligence. Opponents like Paul weren't just products of an unjust system, they were measures of the change she was determined to achieve. These memories weighed on Angela's mind as she turned onto a quiet street. Each step of her journey formed a piece of a larger puzzle about resilience and faith in justice. And now, sitting in her car, Angela knew she wasn't merely carrying her father's legacy and Karen's faith, she bore the responsibility of those she represented. Angela took a deep breath. The darkness outside deepened, but the light within her had never been brighter. She was ready for the challenges ahead, and obstacles like Paul Stevens only strengthened her resolve. The car came to a stop in front of St. Mary's Church, a modest structure with red brick walls and vibrant stained glass windows. Angela stepped out, taking a deep breath. She had just left the tense atmosphere of the police station to enter a completely different space. One where she would face the community she had vowed to serve and protect. That evening's meeting was being held in the church's modest hall, a familiar venue for conversations filled with both hope and frustration from the residents of East Grandview. Angela had attended similar gatherings in the past, but tonight, as police chief, she knew every pair of eyes would be fixed on her, brimming with both expectation and skepticism. The small meeting room buzzed with murmurs as Angela walked in. Gloria Jenkins, a seasoned and respected community leader, clapped her hands to call for attention. "We have a special guest tonight," Gloria announced with a commanding voice. "Chief Angela Carter. Let's welcome her." A smattering of applause rippled through the room. Angela offered a calm smile, stepped forward, and thanked the audience. "I'm here to listen," she began, her gaze sweeping across the room. "I want to hear your thoughts on what needs to change, and I'm committed to doing everything in my power to improve the relationship between the police and this community." Larry Thomas, a middle-aged man with silver hair and a deep, steady voice, stood up. He moved forward slowly, leaning on a small cane for support. "Chief Carter," he began, his eyes locking with hers as if searching for sincerity in her words. "I've lived in Grandview all my life. Let me be blunt. I've never seen the police treat people like me fairly." The room fell silent. Larry recounted an incident from a few years ago when he was pulled over for improper driving on his way home. He had committed no traffic violation, yet the officers ordered him out of the car, searched it, and acted menacingly when he asked why. "They found nothing," he said, his voice quivering with emotion. "All they left me with was fear, and anger in my children's eyes when they asked why their father was treated that way." Angela froze momentarily, moved by Larry's words. His story wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a voice for many in this community. She clenched her hands tightly, careful not to reveal her emotions. But inside, her resolve to drive reform burned even brighter. After Larry's heartfelt account, the room's tension softened as a young girl, about 8 years old, stepped forward. It was Jamie, Gloria's granddaughter, a wide-eyed child with pigtails and a shy demeanor. Jamie timidly approached Angela, clutching a piece of paper with a drawing. Angela crouched down, smiling, and took the drawing. It depicted a woman in a police uniform standing among a group of people, all wearing bright smiles. Above them, in clumsy handwriting, were the words, "Chief Carter, bring peace." Angela felt her throat tighten. That simple drawing carried a profound message: hope, expectation, and a weighty responsibility. Gazing into Jamie's innocent eyes, Angela realized that her actions were shaping not just the present, but also the future for children like Jamie. "Thank you, Jamie," Angela said softly, her voice laced with emotion. "I'll do everything I can to make sure I don't let you down." Unnoticed by most, Captain Mark Johnson leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, watching intently. He hadn't come to support Angela, but to evaluate her. What he saw only deepened his doubts. To Mark, Angela wasn't a genuine leader, just a symbol of political pressures from above. He thought, pretty speeches are one thing, but she has no idea what's waiting for her inside the force. Mark's icy gaze drifted over the drawing Angela held. To him, these gestures were merely symbolic, with no real place in the harsh reality he knew. Before the meeting ended, he turned and left, his mind already made up. If Angela failed, he would be the first to seize control. As the gathering concluded, Angela left the church with a heavy heart, but renewed determination. Stories like Larry's and images like Jamie's drawing were not just reminders, they were powerful motivators. Angela knew she would face countless challenges, from individuals like Mark Johnson to an entrenched system riddled with inequities. But she refused to allow herself to stop. the glow of street lights reflected off her car's windows as Angela drove home. In her heart, a promise echoed. Not just for Jamie or Larry, but for everyone in this city, I will do everything I can to replace fear with justice. Angela drove down the deserted streets, her mind still lingering on the stories and faces of the community she had just met at the church. Jamie's drawing lay neatly on the seat beside her, a vivid reminder of why she had chosen this path. But the flash of blue and red lights in her rearview mirror suddenly pulled her from her thoughts. A police car closed in behind her, its lights flashing and sirens shattering the quiet night. Angela frowned, glancing at her speedometer. She was driving well below the limit. There was no reason for her to be stopped. She pulled over, leaving the engine running, and looked in her mirror as two officers exited the vehicle. Both were white. The lead officer, Paul Stevens, walked deliberately toward her, exuding an air of authority, while his partner, Daniel Harris, followed hesitantly, his unease evident in his posture. Angela could feel the tension in their approach. Not just seriousness, but a clear display of power. Paul knocked sharply on her window, his eyes scrutinizing her through the glass. Angela slowly rolled it down, maintaining her composure. "Where are you headed tonight?" Paul asked, his tone heavy and unfriendly. He didn't bother to explain why she'd been stopped. Angela met his gaze, her expression unyielding. "I'm heading home," she replied evenly. "Have I done something wrong, officer?" Paul smirked, as though her question annoyed him. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area, license and registration now." Angela understood the implication in his tone. This wasn't genuine suspicion, but a calculated provocation. Calmly, she handed over her documents, her eyes never leaving his. Meanwhile, Daniel Harris stood back, his gaze darting uneasily between his partner and the unfolding scene, clearly uncomfortable with how Paul was handling the situation. Paul glanced at her papers dismissively before probing further. "You live around here? It seems unusual to see someone like you driving this way at this hour." Angela held her composure, though the question dripped with bias. "I've lived here my whole life. Now, can you tell me why I've been stopped?" Paul folded his arms, leaning closer as the squad car's lights illuminated his face. "We're allowed to check on anyone we find suspicious. It's for the community's safety." His words sliced through Angela's patience. She knew this routine all too well, the abuse of authority cloaked under the guise of standard procedure. Angela noted the stark difference between Paul and Daniel. While Paul sought to intimidate, Daniel seemed to wrestle internally, debating whether to intervene. "Step out of the car, ma'am," Paul repeated, his voice louder this time as if to assert dominance. But now his irritation was no longer masked. Angela fixed her gaze on him, her tone calm but commanding. "I want to know the legal reason for your request. What have I done wrong?" Paul took a deep breath, trying to restrain his anger. "You're wasting our time. This is standard procedure. I won't ask again." Angela tilted her head, her sharp eyes seeming to pierce through him. She understood clearly that this situation was no longer about the law. It was a display of power, and she would not allow herself to be intimidated. "I won't step out of the car simply because you've asked, officer. Either provide a legitimate reason or end this now." As the tension escalated, Angela noticed a light from a phone pointed in her direction. Not far away, a woman stood at the edge of the road, holding up her phone to record the incident. It was Maria Lopez, a resident. Maria, a single mother, was no stranger to seeing police stop people of color in the neighborhood without just cause. Witnessing the scene, she decided not to remain a passive observer. "Hey!" Maria called out loudly, stepping closer. "What's going on here? Why's she being stopped?" Paul spun around, startled. Maria's sudden appearance felt like an arrow piercing the shield of authority he was trying to project. "This doesn't concern you," he snapped, his voice harsh. "Step back and don't interfere." But Maria stood her ground. "I'm just recording. That's not illegal, is it, officer?" She raised her phone higher, ensuring its light captured every gesture Paul made. "We have a right to know what's happening in our neighborhood." Angela glanced at Maria, a quiet sense of gratitude welling up within her. She was no longer alone. Maria's presence not only brought the situation into public view, but also added pressure on both Paul and Daniel. Paul took a step back, realizing that Maria's involvement had completely shifted the dynamics. He exhaled deeply, struggling to regain his composure. "We're doing our job," he said through gritted teeth. "There's nothing for you to interfere with." Maria smirked, her defiance unmistakable. "If there's nothing wrong, why are you so worried about me filming?" Angela slowly turned her eyes back to Paul and spoke, her tone steady yet razor-sharp. "Officer Stevens, if you can't provide a valid reason for your demand, I suggest you end this immediately. Don't let this go any further." Finally, Daniel broke his silence, his voice low but imploring. "Paul, maybe we should stop this," he said, almost as if pleading. Paul turned on him with a glare, his anger boiling over. "She's causing a disturbance," Paul shouted, but his voice wavered, losing the confidence it carried earlier. Deep down, he realized he had overstepped, but Maria's presence left him cornered, unable to retreat without humiliation. Angela's steady gaze remained on Paul, sensing the internal conflict he was grappling with. This was the moment she needed to take control. "Officer Stevens," she said, lowering her voice but infusing it with authority, "if you can't provide a legitimate reason, your continued detainment of me could be considered harassment. And with that video," she glanced toward Maria, "this situation won't end here." Paul tried to maintain control of the situation, but his confidence was slipping. "All right, you want to play hardball?" Paul said, his voice slicing through the tense air. "I can call for backup to resolve this." Angela tilted her head slightly, a faint smile crossing her lips. She knew this was the moment to end the charade. In a voice calm but icy, she looked Paul directly in the eyes. "Officer Stevens, perhaps you should know who I am before you make a mistake you can't undo." Paul raised an eyebrow, confusion flickering across his face, but he quickly masked it with a mocking smirk. "Oh? And who are you? A lawyer? A politician?" He let out a cold laugh, which abruptly stopped as Angela reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her badge. "Angela Carter," she said, her voice as sharp as a blade. "The new police chief of this district, which means, Stevens, I'm your superior." Paul froze, his eyes fixed on the badge in Angela's hand, as though it were an alien artifact suddenly thrust into his reality. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The arrogance on his face evaporated, replaced by confusion and a hint of panic. "You're saying... you're..." he stammered, his gaze darting to Daniel as if seeking support. Daniel, who had been silent and hesitant the entire time, now looked as though he'd been struck by lightning. He stared at Angela, then at Paul, and tightened his lips. "Oh my God," Daniel muttered, lowering his eyes as though unable to meet Angela's. "Paul, we've made a huge mistake." Paul seized on Daniel's words like a lifeline. No, this is just a misunderstanding," he said quickly, his tone rushed and flustered. "We were just following procedure. We didn't mean any harm." Angela raised an eyebrow and stepped out of her car slowly, her presence dominating the space. The flashing police lights illuminated her uniform, highlighting the badge still clutched in her hand. "Procedure?" she repeated, her voice cutting like a scalpel. "Your procedure is to pull me over without cause, demand I step out of my vehicle, intimidate me, and abuse your authority?" Paul opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He stood there, visibly struggling to hold on to the last shreds of his composure. Angela took another step toward him, her gaze burning with intensity. "That's the problem, Stevens. You didn't know it was me, and you thought that permitted you to act this way toward anyone you deemed suspicious. This isn't about me. It's about how you wield your power without accountability." Daniel took a step back, his hands clenched tightly, regret evident in his expression. I'm sorry, Chief," he said softly, his tone genuine. "I shouldn't have let this escalate. I'll take responsibility for my actions." Angela regarded Daniel for a moment, recognizing the sincerity of his apology, but she didn't let that diminish the gravity of her message. "Daniel, accountability isn't just about admitting mistakes. It's about changing your behavior moving forward. If you truly want to do this job well, start by understanding your role, to serve the community, not to dominate it." Paul, despite being cornered, tried to salvage some pride. "We were just doing our jobs, Chief. If you have a problem, maybe we can discuss it in a more appropriate setting." Angela let out a dry laugh, her eyes still piercing. "A more appropriate setting? Do you think I'd wait for a meeting to address this? No, Stevens, I want you to understand here and now. Your behavior is unacceptable in any setting." Paul had nothing left to say. He stood there, shoulders slumped, unable to meet Angela's gaze. Angela surveyed both officers one final time before lowering her voice, firm yet unforgiving. "I won't file a report about this time, but consider this your final warning. If you continue to act this way, you won't have a place in my department." Angela didn't rush to leave after issuing her warning. The flashing lights of the patrol car behind her continued to illuminate the scene, serving as both a symbol of authority and a reminder of the injustice she had just experienced. Paul Stevens stood frozen, his gaze unfocused, while Daniel Harris lowered his head, the regret on his face unmistakable. Angela walked slowly toward them, her gaze piercing not only their actions but also exposing the truths of the system they represented. "I don't need you to apologize to me personally," she said, her voice low but firm. "This isn't about me. It's about how you treat anyone you consider different or out of place." Angela stared directly at Paul, who still clung to the remnants of his arrogance. "Officer Stevens, you think stopping me without cause is just part of your job. But ask yourself, how many times have you stopped someone because they seemed suspicious, simply based on their skin color or appearance?" Paul opened his mouth to retort, but Angela pressed on, giving him no chance to interrupt. "I don't blame you alone. You're not the only problem. You're a product of a system that taught you your power outweighs your duty to serve the community. That system has allowed you, and many like you, to abuse authority without accountability." Daniel, still standing a few steps back, finally lifted his head, his voice trembling. I don't think we didn't mean to do anything wrong. It's just the way we've always done things." Angela turned to Daniel, her gaze softening but retaining its stern edge. "Harris, that's exactly the problem. You think this way of doing things is normal. Let me make it clear. There's nothing normal about treating your citizens as suspects without cause, and if you can't understand that, you have no place in this force." As Angela spoke, the headlights of another police car lit up the street. A second patrol team had arrived, led by Megan Rhodes, one of Angela's most trusted subordinates. Megan stepped out of the car, immediately recognizing Angela at the center of the situation. She quickly signaled to the other officers to keep their distance before approaching. "Chief Carter?" Megan asked, her expression a mix of surprise and respect. "What's going on here?" Angela looked at Megan, feeling a sense of relief at seeing a familiar face. "Rhodes, you got here just in time. I was just pulled over without cause by Stevens and Harris." Megan turned to face Paul and Daniel, her expression hardening with disappointment. "Stevens, Harris," she said, her tone stern. "Do you realize what you've done? This is our police chief, and even if you didn't know, you have no right to treat any citizen this way." Paul stammered out a weak defense, but Megan raised her hand to silence him. "There's no excuse that can fix this," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "We're supposed to do better. Your actions tonight are a failure, not just for you, but for all of us." With Megan's presence, the atmosphere at the scene shifted dramatically. Paul, who had previously clung to his authority, now had nothing left to say. His shoulders slumped as he realized the situation had spiraled beyond his control. Daniel, though remorseful, couldn't hide the fear of the consequences they both would now face. Angela stood firm at the center of it all, a pillar of strength amidst the storm. "I won't let this incident be swept under the rug," she said, addressing both officers before turning to Megan. "Rhodes, I want a full report of this incident on my desk by tomorrow morning." Megan nodded, her expression resolute. "I'll take care of it, Chief." As Angela prepared to leave, Paul spoke up, his voice low but tinged with bitterness. "Chief Carter, if you think changing a system as entrenched as this is going to be easy, you're in for disappointment. We do our jobs based on what we've been taught." Angela stopped, turning back to face Paul. She looked him straight in the eye. "You're right, Stevens. Change isn't easy. But I'm not here to do what's easy. I'm here to do what's necessary. And if you can't adapt, you won't have a place on this team." Paul said nothing in response. Angela returned to her car, her heart heavy but her resolve unwavering. Megan's arrival had prevented the situation from escalating further, but Angela knew there was still much work to be done to dismantle the deeply ingrained biases and injustices within the force. As she drove away, the flashing police lights faded in her rearview mirror, but the light within her burned even brighter. This battle was just beginning, and Angela would not back down. The following morning, Angela walked into the main conference room of the police department with an air of unshakable authority. The officers inside had been waiting, their expressions a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and, in some cases, defiance. The room, though not particularly large, felt stifling under the weight of the tension that hung in the air. This was no ordinary meeting. It was Angela's declaration to reestablish order within the Grandview Police Department. Her eyes swept across the room. Officer Paul Stevens sat to the left, arms crossed over his chest, his face set in a scowl of discomfort and defiance. Beside him, Daniel Harris avoided eye contact with anyone, his unease from the previous night still evident. A few other officers, likely aligned with Paul, exchanged subtle glances as if waiting to see what Angela would say, but not everyone wore the same expression. To her right, John Miller, a younger officer who had joined the force only a few years earlier, sat upright, his gaze steady and focused. Angela took note of him, a glimmer of hope amidst the sea of resistance. Angela stood at the head of the table, her hands firmly planted on its surface, exuding complete control. "I've called this meeting to address an issue that I believe has plagued this department for far too long," she began, her voice steady but edged with authority. "Last night, I was stopped by 2 officers from this department without any valid cause." A murmur rippled through the room. A few officers seated at the back exchanged startled glances, their surprise evident. Angela let the silence stretch for a few moments before continuing. That behavior wasn't just a breach of protocol. It was a symptom of a much larger problem, a disregard for accountability and the rights of the very community we're sworn to serve. This isn't an isolated incident. It's a reflection of a system I will not tolerate. Paul Stevens couldn't hold back. Rising to his feet, his voice carried a thinly veiled sarcasm. With all due respect, Chief, we can't do our jobs if we're constantly afraid of being judged. We're just following the training we've been given, protecting the community and protecting ourselves. Angela's sharp gaze landed on Paul, her eyes cutting like steel. Protecting the community? She echoed coldly. And how exactly do you define protection, Stevens? Is it stopping anyone you deem suspicious without a legitimate reason? Or is it using authority to mask unprofessionalism? Paul clenched his jaw but said nothing. Nearby, a few officers nodded subtly in agreement with Angela, though none dared to speak up. Meanwhile, John Miller's eyes seemed to shine with newfound determination. Miller stood up, breaking the silence with a clear and steady voice. Chief, I believe you're right. Behavior like that doesn't just erode the community's trust. It also disheartens those of us who want to do the right thing. The room fell completely silent. Miller continued, his determined eyes fixed on Angela. I joined this force to serve and protect, not to watch colleagues abuse their power. If we don't change, we're not just hurting the community, we're hurting this department. Angela nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. Thank you, Miller. That's the kind of spirit I want to see in this force. And I believe many of you feel the same way. She turned back to the group, her voice rising with conviction. I'm not here to make you comfortable. I'm here to ensure we do the job we swore to do. And if any of you can't align with that, there's the door. I won't hold on to anyone unwilling to change. Her gaze lingered on Paul, her eyes as sharp as a blade. Stevens, I hope you understand that last night wasn't just a warning for you. It was a reminder that this system must change, and that change begins with me. Paul didn't respond, sinking back into his chair, his shoulders visibly deflated. Angela knew his resistance wouldn't fade easily, but she also knew she had taken the first necessary step. As the meeting adjourned and the officers filed out, a few stopped to acknowledge Angela with a nod or a quiet word, signaling respect or at least acceptance. John Miller was the last to leave. He paused by Angela's side, nodding firmly. If you need someone to support the change, I'm here to help. Angela smiled, feeling a spark of hope. I'll keep that in mind, Miller. Left alone in the now empty room, Angela sat down and exhaled deeply. What she had done was necessary, but she knew it was only the beginning of a long, grueling battle. Yet, with allies like Miller on her side, Angela believed change was within reach. The fight was only starting, and she was ready. As Paul Stevens stepped out of the conference room, the bright lights in the hallway did little to dispel the heaviness in his chest. Angela's words still echoed in his mind, cutting through his pride like a sharp blade. He moved quickly past his colleagues, avoiding their gazes, but he couldn't escape the disappointment he felt in himself. Behind him, Daniel Harris followed silently, clearly grappling with his thoughts. The two stopped at the parking lot. Daniel was the first to break the heavy silence. Paul, do you think maybe she's right? Maybe we were wrong? Paul stopped in his tracks and turned to face Daniel, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and confusion. Wrong? Wrong about what? We were just doing what we had to do. Don't let her words mess with your head. Daniel stayed quiet, but doubt flickered in his eyes. He knew Paul prided himself on his certainty in every situation, but it didn't ease the weight growing in Daniel's OWIST. His mind wandered back to his early days working with Paul, and he knew he bore some responsibility for enabling Paul's behavior. Daniel recalled his first day on the job 3 years ago. Paul Stevens, then a seasoned officer, had been assigned to mentor him. Initially, Paul had seemed approachable, but it didn't take long for Daniel to notice that Paul's confidence often came with a troubling abuse of power. 2 years ago, during a routine patrol, Daniel had witnessed Paul pull over a young black couple for no apparent reason. When Daniel asked why they'd been stopped, Paul had merely smirked. "You're new, Harris. Learn to trust your instincts. If someone feels off, that's reason enough." Daniel hadn't protested, not because he agreed, but because he felt pressured. Paul was a respected voice in the department, and Daniel feared that speaking up would make him a target for criticism or ostracism. Those memories, along with countless similar incidents, filled Daniel with regret. He hadn't agreed with Paul's methods, but he also hadn't dared to challenge them. And last night, as Angela Carter stood before them, every complicit moment of silence came rushing back to haunt him. Paul leaned against a wall, his eyes staring into the distance. Angela's words hadn't just sparked anger in him, they had also dredged up a memory he had tried to forget. 5 years ago, Paul had been a promising young officer known for his boldness and decisiveness. Not everyone was impressed by his approach, though. Ethan Blake, a senior officer at the time, had once warned Paul about his overreach. Paul remembered their last conversation. It had been during an investigation that Paul had overstepped his authority by interrogating a witness without proper clearance. After the meeting, Ethan had pulled him aside. "Paul, you're walking a dangerous path," Ethan had said, his voice steady but firm. "You think this badge gives you the power to do whatever you want, but remember this: power doesn't come without responsibility. If you can't control it, that power will destroy you." Paul had dismissed Ethan's advice with a scoff. "I know what I'm doing. If you can't handle the pressure, maybe you're in the wrong line of work." Not long after, Ethan had transferred to another precinct and Paul had continued his career, never reflecting on those warnings. But now, standing in the parking lot, Ethan's words came flooding back, a painful reminder of the position Paul had placed himself in. "Paul," Daniel said, snapping Paul out of his thoughts, "you can't keep going like this. I've turned a blind eye for too long, but maybe Ethan Blake was right. You need to change." Paul frowned, his eyes flashing with a mix of anger and hurt. "You don't know what you're talking about, Harris. She's trying to destroy the way we work, to tear down the system we've built." "Maybe that system needs to be torn down," Daniel said, his voice steady for the first time. "Because if it makes us treat people the way we did last night, it's not worth protecting." Paul turned away, saying nothing more. The silence between them was heavy, an unbreakable wall. Daniel knew he couldn't change Paul, but he also knew he no longer wanted to be part of this cycle of injustice. As they left the parking lot, each man was consumed by his thoughts. Paul wasn't ready to accept what had happened, but cracks in his pride had begun to show. Daniel, on the other hand, was more determined than ever not to follow Paul's path. These reflections not only illuminated the reasons behind their actions, but also raised deeper questions about the system they had both been caught in. Angela Carter had ignited a spark of change, but was it strong enough to dismantle the entrenched habits and beliefs within the police force? That battle was still ahead. The soft light from St. Mary's Church illuminated the street as Angela stepped inside. Just the previous night, this was where she had received a simple yet profoundly hopeful drawing from young Jamie. Now, the small meeting room inside was once again packed. The residents had gathered, not just to listen to Angela, but to question her about the changes she had promised to bring. Angela walked slowly to the podium, her gaze sweeping across the room. Familiar faces like Gloria Jenkins, Larry Thomas, and Maria Lopez were present. But this time, their expressions carried not just hope, but also skepticism. The incident with Paul Stevens and Daniel Harris had spread quickly through the community, and they were here to see if it was just a one-off warning or the beginning of true reform. Standing at the podium, Angela didn't need a microphone. Her voice rang out strong and clear. I am here tonight because I know that trust between the police department and this community has been broken for far too long. What happened last night is just one example of what you've been enduring for years. But I'm not here to defend those actions. I'm here to promise that they will not go unaddressed. A few scattered claps broke the silence, but Angela could feel the hesitation in the room. These people needed more than words. They needed action. Gloria Jenkins, the elder stateswoman of the community with her sharp gaze and commanding presence, rose from her seat in the front row. She adjusted her scarf and locked eyes with Angela. Chief Carter, she began, her voice steady but firm. I've heard many people before you promise change, but nothing ever happened. Last night, you faced injustice, something we deal with every day. So, tell me, how can we trust that this time will be any different? Her question hung in the air, silencing the room. Angela met Gloria's gaze without flinching, fully aware of the weight of her words. This wasn't a question that could be answered with a simple promise. I can't change everything overnight, Angela replied, her voice soft but resolute. But I can start by holding myself accountable. I have already ordered an internal investigation into the actions of Stevens and Harris, and I am committed to ensuring that any misconduct is met with appropriate consequences. But this is not something I can do alone. Angela paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. This community is a part of the solution. I need you to help me, to tell me what issues you face and what you need from us. I need you to hold us accountable. Larry Thomas stood next. Chief, your words sound good, but we need results. We've had so many meetings like this in the past, and all of us went home without seeing anything change. Do you have a concrete plan, or is this just another set of empty promises? Angela clenched her hands but kept her voice calm. You're right, Mr. Thomas. Words alone aren't enough. My plan has 3 key components. First, I will implement mandatory anti-bias training for the entire force. Second, I will establish an independent oversight committee that includes community members to review incidents of misconduct. And finally, I will work to increase positive police presence, not to control, but to build trust. Maria Lopez, who had filmed the incident the night before, raised her hand to speak. I saw what you did last night, Chief, and I believe you genuinely want change. But I want to make one thing clear. Change doesn't just come from the police. We, the community, also need to step up and be part of the process. Maria turned to address the room. We can't just sit back and wait for her to fix everything. We need to speak up, participate in discussions, and ensure we are part of the solution. Maria's words drew nods of agreement and scattered applause. Angela felt a sense of relief. Finally, it seemed she wasn't fighting alone. As the meeting drew to a close, Angela moved to the center of the room, her eyes meeting those of the people around her. I can't promise perfection, but I can promise that I will keep fighting. And I need you to fight alongside me. The room erupted in applause. Not a thunderous ovation, but an acknowledgement from a community used to skepticism, yet willing to give hope another chance. As Angela stepped out of the church, Gloria stopped her. You spoke well, Carter. Gloria said, her tone softer now. "But I'll be watching you. Don't let us down." Angela nodded, her gaze firm. "I won't let you down, Miss Jenkins. We'll do this together." After the community meeting, Angela returned to the police station with a mix of heaviness and resolve. Gloria Jenkins had posed a question that Angela couldn't shake. How could the community trust that this time would be different? Angela knew empty promises wouldn't suffice. The change had to start here, within the very force she led, and she also knew not everyone would join her on this journey. Daniel Harris sat in his small office, staring at the notes from the internal investigation. The black and white lines of text blurred before his eyes, while his mind was consumed by images from that night. Angela's piercing gaze, her sharp words, and the regret that had haunted him since. Daniel recalled all the times he'd stayed silent when Paul Stevens crossed the line, convincing himself he was just following protocol. But now, he couldn't ignore the truth. His silence wasn't just complicity, it was a betrayal of the values he'd believed in when he joined the police force. Not long after the meeting, Daniel decided to confront Angela, a decision he knew wouldn't be easy. "Chief Carter," he said, his voice low but steady, "I want to take responsibility. I was wrong to stay silent, and I want to change." Angela looked at him for a moment, assessing the sincerity in his words. "Harris, acknowledging your mistakes is the first step," she said, "but action is what matters. I want you to participate in the anti-bias training we're implementing. Show me you're not just talking, you're acting." Daniel nodded, understanding this was his chance to make things right. Over the following weeks, he attended every training session, listening to stories from the community and his colleagues, gradually learning to see his work through a new lens. While Daniel worked to atone for his mistakes, Paul Stevens took a very different path. Following the emergency meeting, Angela had ordered an internal investigation into Paul's conduct, not just from that night, but also based on previous complaints about his abuse of authority. The initial findings didn't surprise Angela. The investigations revealed that Paul had been the subject of numerous complaints for overstepping his authority, but those reports had often been ignored or dismissed by colleagues loyal to him. This time, however, things were different. Angela was determined not to let any misconduct be swept under the rug. Paul was placed on suspension pending the outcome of the investigation. When he was notified, he did not attempt to hide his anger. "This is a political game," he shouted in his office, his eyes red with fury. "She's trying to take me down just to prove her power." But deep down, Paul knew his anger couldn't mask the truth. He had crossed the line too many times, and this time, no one was there to protect him. A week later, Angela called for an all-hands meeting at the station to deliver an important address. She stood at the podium, looking out at the familiar faces, from seasoned officers like Captain Mark Johnson to younger recruits like John Miller. The atmosphere was heavy, weighed down by the recent events. "We are at a turning point," Angela began, her voice firm. "I know many of you feel uneasy. These changes aren't easy, and there will be those who resist them. But I want to make one thing very clear. None of us, myself included, are exempt from accountability in this effort to reform." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room. "I've seen mistakes happen in this department, abuses of power, silent complicity, but I've also seen tremendous potential. I've seen people like Harris who are willing to acknowledge their mistakes and change. I've seen people like Miller who dare to stand up for what's right." Angela took a step forward, her voice growing even stronger. "But to move forward, we have to work together. We have to break old habits, dismantle deep-seated biases, and rebuild trust with the community we swore to protect." And I promise you this: under my leadership, no one will be allowed to stand on the sidelines." A round of applause broke out, starting with people like John Miller and Daniel Harris, and then spreading through the room. Angela knew not everyone fully believed in her words yet, but this was the first step, a necessary step toward change. As the meeting concluded, Angela left the room feeling a small sense of relief. She knew the battle ahead would be long, but today she had seen a glimmer of hope. People like Daniel and Miller were proof that change wasn't impossible. Out in the hallway, she encountered Daniel. He stood tall, his posture more confident than when they first met. "Thank you for giving me this chance," he said. Angela nodded, smiling. "Show me I wasn't wrong to believe in you." And Paul Stevens? He sat alone in an empty room, facing the consequences of his actions. But whether he would learn from his mistakes remained to be seen. The battle was far from over, but Angela knew she had taken the right first steps. It was late when Angela drove away from the station. She felt tired, but it wasn't the kind of exhaustion that drained her. It was the kind that carried hope. The applause in the meeting room and the commitment of people like Daniel Harris and John Miller left a small light shining amid a long, dark journey. Angela turned onto a quiet street leading to her home. The small, cozy house, with its warm yellow lights spilling from the windows, was the only place where she truly felt she could lay down her burdens, even for a moment. As she stepped inside, her eyes immediately fell on Jamie's drawing, a simple yet meaningful image resting on her desk. Angela smiled softly and walked over to pick it up. In the gentle light of the room, Angela studied every line of the drawing. The image of a police officer standing amidst smiling community members with the words scrawled above, "Chief Carter, bring peace." She remembered the moment Jamie handed her the drawing at the church, her innocent eyes brimming with boundless trust. For Angela, the drawing wasn't just a gift. It was a symbol of hope. Not only Jamie's hope, but the hope of an entire community. Angela sighed, not out of exhaustion, but with a deep sense of responsibility. The first step she had taken, confronting Paul Stevens, igniting change in Daniel Harris, rebuilding trust with the community, were all small, yet indispensable. But Angela knew these steps were only the beginning. The system she faced wasn't just individuals like Paul or incidents like the traffic stop. It was a deeply entrenched structure with habits, mindsets, and biases that had festered for decades. Paul Stevens was a clear example of this. His resistance stemmed not only from his personality but from a system that had taught him power could be wielded without accountability. Paul was a product of that system, but he was also the greatest challenge Angela had to overcome. She knew there might be more Paul Stevens within the force, those who resisted change, who refused to confront their failings. But she also believed there were more like Daniel Harris and John Miller, willing to change and do what was right. Angela placed the drawing back on her desk, but this time she didn't see it as just a reminder. It was a promise she had made to herself. Systems could be changed, but to change them required perseverance, determination, and unwavering faith. She thought back to Gloria Jenkins' words at the community meeting, "Don't let us down." Those words weren't pressure. They were a compass. Angela knew the trust of the community was the most precious thing she had to protect. Outside, the streetlights bathed the road in a gentle glow, and Angela savored the rare quiet. It wasn't the stillness of an ending. It was the stillness of a new beginning. Within her, a steady flame continued to burn, a belief that no matter how hard or how long it took, change was possible. Angela sat down in her chair, her gaze drifting out the window into the night. In the darkness, she didn't just see the challenges ahead, She saw a path leading toward justice and trust, and on that path she knew she wasn't walking alone. People like Jamie, Gloria Jenkins, Maria Lopez, Daniel Harris, and John Miller, all of them were part of this journey. She smiled softly, murmuring to herself, "This is only the beginning." Angela Carter's story reminds us that even in a system entrenched in injustice, change can begin with small but resolute steps. If you were in Angela's position, how would you face an unjust system? What do you think is the most important factor in creating sustainable change? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more inspiring tales, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to help spread these meaningful messages to others. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.